It started on a Thursday night in early September at our place in Riverton, Colorado, one of those evenings where the air already felt colder than it should have been, and Megan had spent the entire afternoon cleaning like we were hosting someone important instead of three women she barely knew from her CrossFit gym. Vanessa Harper arrived first, loud voice, sharper eyes, the kind of confidence that felt rehearsed rather than natural, and she carried herself like every room already belonged to her. Tara Benson came in next, barely looking up from her phone, her smile flickering on and off as if she was tracking something happening somewhere else, while Brooke Dalton followed last, quiet but radiating a kind of bitterness that made even polite conversation feel like walking across thin glass. I noticed the way they looked at me before they even sat down, quick assessments, half smiles, shared glances over wine glasses that didn't match the casual dinner Megan had promised me. Halfway through the meal the energy shifted, subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, and their side conversations grew quieter whenever I spoke, which only made me pay more attention. My job has trained me to notice inconsistencies, small behavioral tells that signal when people are hiding intent, and the way Vanessa kept steering the conversation back toward relationships and loyalty felt deliberate rather than random. Megan looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt, and that was the first moment I realized this wasn't just a social visit. Finally Vanessa leaned back in her chair, smiling like she was about to reveal a punchline, and announced that they had designed a 48-hour loyalty test for me, a real-world experiment meant to see if I would stay faithful when faced with carefully arranged temptations, unexpected encounters, and situations that, according to her, made most men fail. The room went quiet after she said it, and I could feel Megan watching me closely, embarrassed yet curious about how I would react, while Tara stared at her phone like she was waiting for confirmation that the script was still on track, and Brooke just studied my face as if she expected anger or defensiveness. Instead I stayed calm, because calm is where I work best, and I asked them to explain the rules, listening to every detail as if it were an audit briefing rather than a social game. The more Vanessa talked, the clearer it became that they had spent time planning this, mapping out scenarios with the confidence of people who assumed they already knew the outcome. Megan avoided my eyes, and that hurt more than the proposal itself, because it meant she hadn't shut the idea down when it first came up. When they finally paused, waiting for a reaction, I set my glass down slowly and agreed to the challenge, not because I needed to prove anything but because refusing would have given them the narrative they were hoping for. I told them that if they were testing me then I would be evaluating them too, not as a threat but as a simple statement of balance, and the shift in the room was immediate. The confident smirks that had defined the evening began to fade, replaced by something more cautious, like they had expected a performance and instead found someone quietly taking notes. Megan looked at me with a mixture of relief and uncertainty, and for the first time that night the three women stopped whispering and just watched, realizing that whatever they had planned might not unfold the way they imagined. Friday morning at 9 sharp I was already standing across the street from the Copper Room Cafe downtown, coffee in hand, watching the entrance through the reflection of a storefront window because the anonymous text I had received the night before telling me to show up alone at that exact time was an amateur move, and whoever had sent it clearly underestimated how my brain works when someone tries to control the setting. I arrived 20 minutes early and positioned myself where I could see without being seen, and right on schedule Vanessa appeared, oversized sunglasses, confident stride, scanning the sidewalk like someone expecting to direct traffic rather than meet for brunch. A few minutes later a young blonde woman approached her, athletic build, nervous smile, the kind of person who looked like she had agreed to something without fully understanding it, and I watched Vanessa lean in, speak briefly, then discreetly press folded bills into her hand, $300 by my count when the wind shifted the edge of the cash just enough for confirmation. Vanessa pointed inside the cafe and the blonde nodded before walking in alone, immediately taking a seat at the bar where she ordered something bright and decorative that screamed performance rather than appetite. I waited another 30 seconds, long enough for Vanessa to believe the setup was proceeding as planned, and then instead of entering through the main door and walking toward the bar like a predictable target I crossed the street, stepped inside, and moved directly toward the corner table where Vanessa had seated herself with a perfect view of the entrance. The moment she saw me approaching her posture stiffened and her hand jerked slightly, nearly sending her mimosa over the edge of the table, and the confidence from the night before cracked just enough for me to see the uncertainty underneath. I sat down without asking, placed my phone on the table, and turned the screen toward her, displaying a clear photograph of her handing the cash to the blonde outside the cafe, timestamp visible in the corner along with the location metadata. I told her calmly that if she was going to orchestrate scenarios she should at least consider her surroundings because public sidewalks tend to have reflective surfaces and security cameras, and people in my line of work tend to notice patterns before walking into them. She tried to laugh it off at first, accusing me of being paranoid, but her voice lacked the sharp edge it had the night before. Then I mentioned Kyle Reynolds, the 28-year-old trainer at her gym whose apartment complex she had been visiting consistently on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings under the explanation of early yoga sessions, which would have been believable if the gym in question actually offered yoga on those days instead of exclusively on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I watched the color drain from her face in real time, the kind of physiological reaction that no amount of bravado can fully suppress, and she immediately accused me of bluffing, claiming I was inventing stories to intimidate her. Without raising my voice I reached into my folder and slid printed court documents across the table, copies of records from her prior divorce settlement detailing $32,000 withdrawn from her ex-husband's small business account during a period that coincided with what she had described publicly as an amicable separation. I did not threaten her, did not imply exposure, did not suggest consequences, because I did not need to. I simply stated that if this was going to be a test of integrity then transparency should apply to everyone involved. The blonde at the bar glanced over twice, clearly confused about why the script was not unfolding, and after a brief, awkward pause she gathered her purse and left without finishing her drink. Vanessa remained seated for another 10 seconds that felt much longer, her hand trembling slightly as she gathered her things, and when she finally stood up she avoided eye contact entirely, walking out of the cafe far less steady than when she had walked in. When I got home that afternoon the house felt different, quieter but not peaceful, like the air had been disturbed and had not yet settled back into place, and Megan was sitting at the kitchen island with her phone in her hand, her expression tight in a way that told me she had already heard from them. Before I even set my keys down she told me that Vanessa, Tara, and Brooke had been calling her nonstop, their voices loud enough through the speaker that she had eventually stepped outside just to escape the echo of it, and according to them I had crossed a line. I had been intimidating, aggressive, unnecessarily intense over what was supposed to be harmless fun. The word intimidating lingered in the room like an accusation, and I could see the conflict on Megan's face because part of her wanted to believe her friends and part of her knew I do not operate on impulse. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself with emotion, because that would have only fed into the narrative they were trying to build, so instead I opened my phone and placed it on the counter between us, showing her the photos from outside the Copper Room Cafe, clear images of Vanessa handing $300 to the blonde woman on the sidewalk, the timestamp visible, the angle unmistakable. Megan leaned closer, her brows knitting together as she zoomed in on the cash, on Vanessa's posture, on the way the woman looked uncertain rather than confident. I explained calmly what had happened, how I had arrived early, how obvious the setup had been, how I had chosen to confront Vanessa directly instead of playing along with something designed to humiliate me for entertainment. Megan listened without interrupting, but I could tell something else was weighing on her, something heavier than just the failed brunch stunt, and after a long pause she unlocked her phone and turned it toward me. She had received screenshots that morning, accidentally forwarded to her instead of their private group chat, and the messages were not subtle. One read, "Megan so clueless," followed by another that said "this is going to be hilarious," and there were laughing emojis beneath it that felt far less harmless in context. Seeing those words shifted something in the room immediately, not because I was surprised, but because Megan was. The embarrassment on her face transformed into something quieter and sharper, the realization settling in that she had not been included in a friendly experiment but positioned as an audience member in her own marriage. She scrolled through the thread again, slower this time, as if hoping the tone would change on a second reading, but it did not, and I watched her shoulders lower slightly, the defensive posture she had held earlier dissolving into reflection. There is a particular silence that happens when trust recalibrates, when someone recognizes they have aligned themselves with the wrong side of a situation, and that silence filled our kitchen as naturally as light through the windows. She did not apologize immediately and I did not demand one, because what mattered more was the shift happening behind her eyes, the moment she stopped viewing this as a playful loyalty test and started seeing it as manipulation wrapped in social theatrics. When she finally looked up at me there was no anger directed my way, only disappointment aimed elsewhere, and for the first time since Thursday night I felt like we were standing on the same side of the line again. The narrative her friends had tried to construct, that I was some defensive husband unable to handle harmless temptation, had cracked under the weight of their own carelessness, and Megan could see it clearly now. But even as that alignment settled between us, I knew from the tone of those messages and the urgency of their calls that they were not finished trying to regain control of the story. At exactly 2 in the afternoon another message came through with nothing but a location pin for Lakewood Ridge Park, and by that point the pattern was obvious enough that I did not even bother responding because silence was more effective than engagement. Megan saw the notification when it lit up on the center console as we drove, and she did not hesitate this time. She simply told me to keep going, her voice steady in a way it had not been the night before. When we pulled into the parking lot, I immediately spotted Tara near a picnic table under a faded blue canopy, her posture tense, eyes darting toward the walking trail every few seconds as if she were waiting for a cue. A few yards away a woman in athletic gear stood stretching beside the path, earbuds in, ponytail pulled tight, performing the role of casual jogger a little too deliberately. I slowed my pace as I stepped onto the trail, pretending not to notice Tara discreetly pressing folded bills into the jogger's hand when she thought no one was watching, and I almost admired the consistency of their approach even if the execution lacked subtlety. The jogger began running toward me with calculated timing, and as we crossed paths she clipped my shoulder just hard enough to send her water bottle flying, the cap popping loose so that cold water splashed across my shirt. She gasped, apologized repeatedly, her tone exaggeratedly concerned, and then offered to let me dry off at her car, which she claimed was parked nearby with extra towels in the trunk. It would have been convincing if it had not been so obviously rehearsed. Before I could even respond, Megan opened the passenger door of our SUV parked along the curb and stepped out holding a large white towel from the back seat, her expression calm and unreadable as she walked toward us. The jogger froze for a fraction of a second, recalculating, and I simply smiled and told her that my wife had me covered. Megan handed me the towel without breaking eye contact with Tara across the grass, and together we turned away from the trail and walked directly toward the picnic table where Tara now sat rigidly, the confidence from earlier replaced with visible anxiety. When we reached her I did not raise my voice or create a scene because volume is unnecessary when facts are precise, and I began by mentioning the offshore gambling accounts linked to Caribbean betting sites that had accumulated $41,000 in losses over the past 18 months. Her face tightened immediately, and she tried to interrupt, but I continued calmly, outlining the public court judgment filed after creditors pursued repayment and the subsequent home equity withdrawal used to settle part of the debt. Megan stood beside me, silent but attentive, absorbing every word as Tara's composure deteriorated. Then I mentioned the education fund for her 9-year-old son, which according to the financial disclosures had dropped from $27,000 to $4,500 during the same period, and that detail seemed to hit harder than the numbers attached to the gambling itself. Tara's eyes filled almost instantly, her breath turning uneven as she whispered that it was none of my business, that I had no right to dig into her life, and she was correct in one sense because it was not my business until she made my marriage hers. I explained without hostility that if we were going to engineer moral tests for entertainment then personal accountability should not be selectively applied. The jogger had already disappeared from the trail, likely aware that the script had collapsed, and the park felt unusually quiet despite the distant sound of children playing near the swings. Tara covered her face with both hands and began crying, shoulders shaking in a way that suggested the weight of more than just this afternoon's failure, while Megan remained composed, not cold but no longer naive. She did not offer comfort to Tara, did not apologize on my behalf, and that absence of reaction spoke louder than anything I could have said. That evening they sent one more message, not a suggestion this time but a demand, telling us to meet them at Briar and Stein Tavern as if they still believed they controlled the setting, and Megan looked at me before we left with a steadiness that told me she was no longer attending as a participant in their game but as someone ready to watch it end. When we walked inside the tavern the shift in atmosphere was immediate because the three of them no longer looked composed or amused, they looked exhausted, makeup hurriedly reapplied over stress, posture defensive rather than confident. Vanessa avoided eye contact entirely, Tara kept her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water she had not touched, and Brooke sat upright with forced defiance, chin lifted as if daring me to try. Brooke was the first to speak and her tone carried a brittle edge as she insisted that I had nothing on her, that whatever I thought I had uncovered about the others did not apply to her, and she almost sounded relieved saying it, like she believed she had navigated carefully enough to stay invisible. I placed a thin folder on the table in front of her and opened it slowly, not theatrically but deliberately, because precision has more impact than aggression. I began with the medical records that were publicly accessible through insurance litigation disclosures, 3 separate physicians prescribing identical anti-anxiety medications under slightly varied diagnostic notes, totaling 270 pills per month across the combined prescriptions. Her expression faltered immediately and she attempted to dismiss it as legal and private, which it was, but that was not the point. Then I turned my phone toward her and displayed screenshots of her public Cash App transaction history, over 140 payments ranging from $50 to $70 each, sent from accounts clearly linked to college-aged users with vague descriptions that avoided specifics but formed a pattern when viewed collectively. I did not accuse her of anything outright, I did not speculate, I simply let the pattern exist in the open air between us, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Brooke's mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came out, and for the first time since this entire situation began she looked genuinely uncertain. I did not raise my voice and I did not insult any of them because that would have shifted the focus away from the facts, and instead I spoke evenly, reminding them that they had walked into my home positioning themselves as judges intent on exposing a potential cheater while carrying secrets of their own involving deception, financial misconduct, and personal instability. I told them that moral authority does not survive double lives, that you cannot manufacture a test of integrity while actively concealing your own compromises, and that if they truly believed in accountability it had to apply uniformly rather than selectively. The tavern noise seemed distant compared to the tension at our table, and Megan sat beside me without interruption, not surprised anymore, not defensive, simply present. I informed them calmly that they had until midnight to confirm that the so-called loyalty test was over and that no further attempts would be made to interfere with our marriage, and I made it clear that confirmation was not a request but an opportunity for closure. We left shortly after, the 3 of them remaining seated in stunned silence, and the drive home felt quieter than any we had taken that week. At 11:47 p.m. my phone vibrated with a single message from Vanessa that read, "This isn't finished," and I showed it to Megan without commentary because the tone said everything it needed to. That was their answer. I do not set deadlines to create drama and I do not repeat myself when a boundary is ignored, so when midnight passed without any acknowledgement beyond Vanessa's vague warning I allowed the contingency measures I had already prepared to move forward exactly as scheduled. Everything I had gathered over the previous days had been obtained legally through public court records, social media archives, professional licensing databases, and documentation accessible through compliance reporting systems, and I had organized it with the same structured precision I use in my career, time-stamped, cross-referenced, and stored in a sequence designed to activate automatically if no agreement was reached. This was never about revenge or spectacle, it was about consequences unfolding in proportion to the intrusion they initiated. At 1:10 a.m., a secure email containing photographs and location data was delivered to Kyle Reynolds' long-term girlfriend, including documented patterns of Vanessa's early morning visits to his apartment complex on days when no yoga sessions existed, the metadata intact and unaltered. At 2 a.m., Tara's husband received certified copies of the publicly filed court judgment tied to the offshore gambling losses, along with financial summaries detailing the home equity withdrawal and the depletion of their son's education fund, all mailed through a verified service that required signature confirmation. At 2:32 a.m., a compliance complaint that had already been formatted and reviewed was electronically submitted to the state medical board regarding Brooke's overlapping prescriptions obtained from 3 separate physicians, not as an accusation of addiction but as a request for a formal review of prescribing practices and potential doctor shopping under regulatory guidelines. I did not sit there watching it unfold in real time because the process required no supervision once initiated, and instead I went to bed beside my wife knowing that by sunrise the illusion of control they had tried to maintain would dissolve under scrutiny they could not deflect with laughter or group chat bravado. By 6:45 a.m. my phone began vibrating steadily on the nightstand, notifications stacking one after another as the fallout rippled outward exactly as predictable as any compliance breach once exposed to daylight. There were frantic messages, missed calls, voicemails layered with panic rather than confidence, and Megan read them quietly beside me without speaking at first. Divorce filings were being discussed before breakfast in Kyle's household, and by mid-morning Tara's husband had initiated contact with an attorney regarding both financial misrepresentation and custody concerns, triggering an emergency hearing request tied directly to documented asset depletion. Brooke's workplace had placed her on temporary administrative suspension pending review of the medical board inquiry, a procedural move standard in cases involving overlapping controlled substance prescriptions. None of this required exaggeration because the systems in place were designed to respond automatically once documentation entered the record. The incoming texts shifted tone rapidly from outrage to desperation, with messages reading "Please make it stop" and "You have ruined everything" appearing in fragmented bursts across the screen, followed by longer paragraphs attempting to redirect blame or appeal to empathy. Megan watched each one without the hesitation she might have shown days earlier, and when she handed the phone back to me there was no doubt left in her expression about where her loyalty stood. I did not respond to a single message because response implies negotiation, and negotiation requires mutual respect that had already been forfeited the moment they stepped into my home with a staged test disguised as moral superiority. By the time the sun fully rose over Riverton, the chaos was no longer contained to whispers or private chats, it was embedded in official records and irreversible processes that no amount of pleading could retract. Sunday morning the doorbell rang in a way that was not polite or hesitant but prolonged and aggressive, and before I even reached the entryway I already knew who was standing on the other side because chaos has a predictable rhythm once it has nowhere else to go. When I opened the door, Vanessa, Tara, and Brooke were on the porch looking nothing like the composed women who had sat at my kitchen table days earlier, their hair unstyled, makeup smeared or absent, clothes thrown on without coordination, each of them carrying the visible strain of sleepless nights and consequences they had not anticipated. Vanessa stepped forward first, voice already raised, accusing me of destroying her marriage because her husband had hired a lawyer that morning and was demanding explanations she could not contain with sarcasm or denial. Tara stood slightly behind her, crying openly, saying that her husband was pursuing temporary full custody of their son until financial matters were reviewed and that there was talk of him moving in full-time while the court evaluated stability. Brooke's voice was quieter but edged with panic as she said she had been terminated pending investigation after the compliance complaint triggered a formal inquiry that her employer could not ignore. They spoke over one another, anger and desperation blending into a chaotic stream of blame directed entirely at me as if I had acted randomly rather than in response to their deliberate attempt to manipulate my marriage. I did not interrupt them because people in panic reveal more than they intend, and I could see Megan standing just behind my shoulder, listening without flinching. When Vanessa finally demanded that I fix what I had done, that I retract everything and call whoever needed to be called, Megan stepped forward before I could respond, her posture calm but unyielding in a way I had not seen before. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried enough clarity to cut through the noise as she told them that they had not been protecting her or looking out for her best interests, that they had been trying to stage a spectacle to confirm their own bitterness about men and relationships. She said they were not interested in truth or loyalty but in proving that every man is as broken as they are, and the words landed with more force than any document I could have handed them. The porch fell silent after that, not because they agreed but because they recognized the shift in allegiance they had miscalculated from the beginning. I went inside briefly and returned with 3 envelopes, each containing copies of the documentation relevant to their own situations, court filings, transaction summaries, compliance submissions, nothing fabricated, nothing embellished, simply reflections of their own actions compiled in orderly form. I handed them out one by one without ceremony and told them clearly to leave our home and to leave our lives, that there would be no further conversation, no negotiation, and no revision of what had already been set into motion. There was no anger in my voice because anger would have suggested impulsiveness, and this had been anything but impulsive. Vanessa glared at me for a long moment as if searching for hesitation she could exploit, but finding none she turned and walked down the driveway first, shoulders rigid. Tara followed more slowly, still crying, clutching the envelope as though it might dissolve if she held it tightly enough. Brooke lingered the longest, eyes flicking between Megan and me as if trying to locate sympathy, but Megan did not offer any, and eventually Brooke stepped back as well. They left one by one, the echo of their footsteps fading from the porch, and when the door closed the house felt still again, not tense this time but settled, like a storm that had finally moved beyond the horizon. 3 months passed, and the noise that had once felt overwhelming settled into documented outcomes and finalized paperwork, the kind that arrives in plain envelopes without emotion attached. Vanessa's divorce was finalized after a series of negotiations that moved quickly once evidence replaced denial, and the confidence she once carried like armor dissolved into the practical realities of asset division and reputation repair. Tara entered a structured gambling recovery program as part of a court-guided agreement and, over time, regained partial custody of her son under supervised financial oversight, a process that required accountability she had resisted until there was no alternative left. Brooke lost her professional license after the medical board concluded its investigation and ultimately accepted a plea deal that reduced potential penalties in exchange for admission and compliance, a resolution that marked the end of the double life she had insisted did not exist. Our house, by contrast, felt different in quieter ways that mattered more than any headline-style fallout. Megan distanced herself completely from the social circle that had once seemed exciting and instead began forming friendships with coworkers she got to know gradually, people whose conversations revolved around work projects, weekend plans, and ordinary frustrations rather than orchestrated drama or moral theatrics. She was slower now to trust but more deliberate, and that deliberateness felt healthy rather than suspicious. The tension that had crept into our kitchen that Thursday night never returned, replaced instead by conversations that were direct and sometimes uncomfortable but always honest. When our 8th anniversary arrived, it was understated, no elaborate gestures or performative celebrations, just dinner at home, soft music playing from the living room, and a sense of stability that felt earned rather than assumed. At one point that evening, Megan looked at me across the table with a small smile that carried more reflection than amusement and said that they thought they were testing me, as if the phrase itself now sounded almost absurd in retrospect. I told her they were testing me, but I measure everything, and I meant it in the most literal sense because patterns reveal themselves to those who observe without reacting prematurely. The loyalty test they had designed was never really about fidelity, it was about validation, about confirming their belief that trust is naive and that every relationship hides inevitable failure waiting to be exposed. What they received instead was exposure of a different kind, not engineered or exaggerated but drawn directly from records they had generated themselves through choices made long before they stepped into my house. I did not celebrate their consequences and I did not regret enforcing boundaries, because both can exist without contradiction when actions align with outcomes. Looking back, I understand that some people create chaos to feel control, while others prepare quietly and respond with structure when challenged. I do not fail tests because I do not walk into them unprepared, and I do not issue warnings I am unwilling to uphold. They initiated an evaluation without realizing that evaluation is my profession, my habit, and my instinct. In the end, there was no dramatic finale, no last confrontation, only the steady closure that comes when patterns run their course and records reflect reality. Case closed.